I work at a venture firm that has really come to value the importance of learning new areas for the
Mhm.
investors. And we say that because Bessemer has been around longer than any venture firm. And I think the reason is that we're very good at reinventing ourselves and creating new strategies. And you can't do that by hiring experts every time you want to change your strategy. If you
Mhm.
hire expert investors, those expert investors are just going to keep investing in what they're expert in. You
Mhm.
need to find people who are critical thinkers, who are and intellectually courageous enough to stop doing what they're doing before that was working and start to learn how to do something different.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how did you get into the world of venture?
So back in 1990, I was working at Oracle as a product manager,
Mhm.
and I saw this big fancy room, and I said, "What's that?" And someone said, "That's the boardroom," and explained to me that it was that the venture capitalists came there once every couple of months. And I remembered my dad told me about venture capitalists, and it sounded like a really fun job. And so I said, "Well, like where do these venture capitalists come from?" Somebody told me that they were all at 3000 Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park. And back then there was no Google map, but I had a regular map printed out. And so I went out to my car and I found my way to 3000 Sand Hill Road, drove there in my Mazda and parked, and then just started walking around. I didn't know any of the names of the companies or the VCs themselves, but just walked into really a random one to start with and asked the receptionist, "Hey, does this venture capital company hire people for the summer?" At that point, I had already decided to go get an MBA back east. And so I thought maybe I'll be able to find a gig for the summer. And the receptionist said, no. I said, oh, well, do any of these venture capital companies hire people for the summer? And she said, yes. And I said, which ones? And she pulled out a book from the shelf called the Western Association of Venture Capitalists or something like that. And she circled the names of 5 venture firms. I'm not exactly sure how this person would actually know which firms were hiring summer people, but and I wish I remember who this person was because today I would go buy her a car. But she circled those names and gave me the book, and I went back to my apartment, and on my dot matrix printer, I printed out 5 letters. That's what we did back then. This was before the age of email, and I sent letters to the 5 firms. One of them was TA Associates, and they ended up hiring me for the summer. And another one of the 5 was Bessemer Venture Partners.
Mhm.
Bessemer did not hire me, but I stayed in touch with them through my business school years, and at the end of which they took pity upon me and hired me, and I've been there ever since.
Nice. How do you sort of like staying in touch with them? Do you write letters since like back in time that's what people do, I assume.
I sent a Hanukkah card to Neil Brownstein, and I was pretty desperate for any reason at all to stay in touch with them, and so I sent him a Hanukkah card. Later on, I received a chain letter which seemed to be somewhat humorous. And so I sent
Mhm.
him one of those too. If you look back at this now, it's like borderline stalking. And today, if somebody parked his car at, 3000 Sandhill and started walking around, walking into offices, I don't think it would be as successful today as I was in 1990. Somehow I managed to stay in touch with Bessemer. I had worked at TA, but TA Associates is a much
Mhm.
later stage venture firm. And for me, I really enjoy the early stage stuff.
Mhm.
And that's why I hounded Bessemer until they hired me.
Yeah, so one of the interesting detail you mentioned, you were working at Worko as a PM. So like, was that your first job or like before venture, what else did you do to kind of like prep yourself into the role of venture?
I had started a software company
Hmm.
when I was a senior in high school called Cambridge Data Systems that created software for private libraries. I mean, today it's not even clear why we need public libraries, but there was a time where companies and particularly law firms
Hmm.
maintained their own very active libraries. My dad was a partner at one of these big law firms. And so when I was visiting him, I saw that they were writing out labels for all the magazines as they distributed it around the
Hmm.
firm. And I said, yeah, they can get a computer to do that. And so I wrote a piece of software called Data Route that printed out these stickers on a dot matrix printer. And I started selling the software to big law firms. And
Hmm.
I probably sold about, I don't know, about 10 of these systems for about $2,000 each, which helped me pay for my college. I didn't know anything about the tech industry. To me, I wasn't trying to learn how to be an entrepreneur. I wasn't preparing for a career at all in software venture capital. I was just trying to, make some coin. And this was, best way I could think to do it. And in fact, when I was finishing my college years, and I thought, this is take some time to service
Mhm.
this and continue to sell it. And I thought, I'm going to get a real job. I sold Cambridge Data Systems to Brad Feld, who's,
Oh my God,
Brad.
really? Yeah.
So
Also in the
he also
book.
had a business called Feld Technologies.
Yeah.
And Brad and I were friends during college. And so I said, I don't know what to do with this thing. He said, well, I'll give you Feld Technologies can run with it. And so that was my first exit. It wasn't a very big one. And at the time, this was, I have to tell you, I didn't know anything about Silicon Valley. I didn't know anything about the tech industry.
Mhm.
I thought that I was going to go off into investment banking or consulting or, something which back then was a more glamorous industry to be in.
Mhm.
Um, and, it wasn't until my friends from the computer science department twisted my arm and said, you got to go interview at Oracle, that I even considered working
Mhm.
in the tech field. And then, after I flew out and I saw the people there and I saw what they were doing, and I realized, oh, you could actually, technology itself is a very exciting career.
Mhm.
I decided to come out to Silicon Valley. And even then, it was kind of meant to be a vacation, like for 2 years before I go back to the East Coast and do real work. So I came out to Silicon Valley, and as I said, I learned about the tech industry and became excited about the opportunities in venture capital.
Yeah, I mean, like that sounds like you actually made some really good friends, like in your peer group. And I didn't know that like the investment or like the investing or like tech world were like that tight. Like you sort of come to another like famous investor back in time. It's crazy. It's just like crazy to connect the dots.
I guess now it seems highly coincidental, but it's true that back then there weren't that many computer science majors around.
Hmm.
Certainly not at Harvard anyway, where I went to college, but even at other schools today, it's the most common concentration, I believe, at many colleges. And back then, it was a small, tight knit community. In fact, when I was in college, really pretty much all the computer science people like me all worked in the science center, in the basement of the science center, in a job called terminal watcher. So I was a terminal watcher, and
What
I
is a
would
terminal watcher?
we sat in the basement where all the terminals were connected to the PDP-11 mini computer, and the students would come down and do their homework, and we would be there to help them figure out how to use these computers. Uh, and we would occasionally, change the tapes on the storage drives, and
Mhm.
that was it. But mostly we just did our homework, and that was the terminal watching job. But I bet
Mhm.
it would be a really interesting study to go out there and look at the terminal watchers from the 1980s and see where they are today, because the ones whom I can remember,
Mhm.
have done some pretty interesting things. I mean, one of them was John Tappan Morris, I think. He was the accidental inventor of the first malware. He wrote a piece of software that jumped around the computer nodes on the ARPANET to collect information, and it kind of went out of control. And it ended up taking down the internet. Probably the only time the internet was ever taken down was by this one accidental worm that he created. He's now a professor of computer science, I think, at Cornell. He was prosecuted for federal crimes for this accident that he had wrought onto the internet. He's actually quite a brilliant researcher, but a lot of other people that I know that I
Mhm.
remember as terminal watchers today are doing all kinds of other interesting things in Silicon Valley and elsewhere.
I wish I know terminal watcher was like a career path that you could take prior to like investing and stuff. But anyway, that's actually really cool. So like my curiosity is like how do you even know computer exists back then? And then like how did you grow up? Like how did you heard about this thing? How do you discover this hobby or something like back then when it was not as popular?
It was definitely a hobbyist thing. Think today
Mhm.
about something like consumer drones.
Mhm.
And a lot of us know people who have drones, and maybe you went to their house and you saw them flying a drone. You thought,
Mhm.
oh, that's pretty fun. That's kind of what it was like in the sort of late 70s and early 80s, was that, you knew somebody, maybe you saw a computer somewhere, a
Mhm.
Commodore or a TRS-80. The first computer I ever saw was a TRS-80 at my friend Adam Goldman's house. And there wasn't even a floppy drive. It was just a tape recorder that you would put a cassette tape into, and you would have to hit play in order for it to output the data. And every time you wanted to record a file, you had to hit record on this tape drive. So that was the first computer that I saw. And then in 1980, IBM came out with the first IBM PC. And my dad, who's a very intellectually curious guy, he bought one. And we had that in the house. And that was really my first exposure to computers. It was because my father had gone off and brought it into the house that I got to play with it. I learned, the first programming I learned was BASIC language, which was the language, of course, that Bill Gates popularized on MS-DOS. The Turtle, this is pre-Turtle BASIC.
Sorry, Turtle was like the earliest I could imagine with anything.
This is all terminals with ASCII characters. And so I learned some BASIC, and then I learned a product called DBase 2, which was a scripting language for database management. And I used that then to create this software for legal libraries. And then when I went to Harvard for college, they just said we're starting a concentration in computer science. It was the first year that it was its own thing instead of just sort of a curiosity of the applied math department. And I just thought it sounded really fun. I had no career aspirations in tech or computer science, but I just thought it sounded like a really fun thing to do.
When was the time that you thought like this could be your career? And when did you like make your like first investment in venture?
So I talked a little bit about how I studied computer science. I never thought it would be a career. My only exposure to people who knew technology were people in the IT departments. I worked for one summer at JP Morgan in their IT department. And I thought that was the sort of the ultimate of what you could do with tech, was that you could support people from an IT perspective, which, is fun for some people to do, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I just didn't even know about the whole software world. And so when my friend said, "Oh, go to this interview with this, startup called Oracle," I hadn't heard of Oracle. I didn't know what they did. I had no idea. I went to this interview, and there was this guy there interviewing me named Larry Lin, who was the recruiter for Oracle. And Larry Ellison had told Larry Lin, "Go off and bring me 150 computer science majors from these 10 schools." So Larry Lin, he didn't care about anything other than the fact that I was, a computer science major from one of these 10 schools, and he had a quota. And so I went to this interview without knowing anything about Oracle, also without knowing anything about database management for that matter, and actually no interest either in even going to work for this company, because I only went to get my friends off my back. So the worst possible candidate for an interview. And 2 minutes into it, he said to me, "I really like you. Here's a plane ticket for you to come to California and visit." Nobody had ever offered me a plane ticket before, and I'd never been to California. So I said, "Okay, I'll go to California." And I just thought that'll be a fun trip. And I went to California, and I saw all my friends, the terminal watchers, there. And it was February, and when I got there, we sat in the hot tub outside one of their apartments in Foster City. And I had just flown from Boston, which was freezing, and I thought, this is a pretty nice life. And I went the next day, and all these folks were, building software, having a great time. Seemed like a really vibrant atmosphere. And at the end of the day, the I had to go stop at the HR manager's office, and she said, "How was your day?" I said, "It was great," but I was sort of I wanted to go back to the airport, go back, and I was done with my little trip. And she said, "Well, what are your salary expectations?" And so in this sort of juvenile way, like an adolescent boy will be really a jerk to a girl so that she breaks up with him or something. I was I came up with some crazy number that was much higher than what the investment banks were offering me. And she said, "Well, that's a lot." And instead of saying, "Well, yeah, but here's why I'm worth it," I just said, "Yeah." And then I said, I have to go. I have to go to the airport. And I just thought that would be the end of it. And then 2 days later, a FedEx envelope shows up, and it had an offer letter in it for exactly what I'd asked for. And I thought,
crazy.
"Oh, that's funny." And I threw it on the side. I threw it in on the floor because I still thought I had no interest in it. And then I went on with my interviews with these investment bankers, and I remember I was in the last round at Shearson Lehman, which was the biggest bank back then. And the managing director said to me, "So if we ask you to stay up all night and copy documents and meet an associate at the airport at 6 a.m., is that okay?" Of course, I probably told him whatever he wanted to hear, but I started thinking about my friends in the hot tub. And I thought, maybe I should go off and do this fun technology thing for a little while. And I actually remember going back to my dorm room literally the next day, and I had to search through a pile of laundry. This is disgusting, I know. I had to search through a pile of laundry to find this FedEx letter And I took it out and I decided, you know what, I'm going to try technology for at least for a couple of years.
Yeah, I so the moral of the story is just have a hot top to like recruit someone
Yeah,
from the East Coast.
yeah.
Anyway,
Uh,
that's crazy. That's such a fun story. So that's how you got into Oracle, right? So like and then like you sort of like have the summer internship at TA Associates. Like what was the first time that you actually invested in a company?
so I went to Bessemer Venture Partners, and
Mhm.
I was the associate. There were basically a bunch of partners, and I was there. And I started looking at startups, and I didn't know
Mhm.
what I was doing at all. And I would bring in these companies for the partners to meet, and they were really bad companies. I mean, it
Mhm.
was none of them were interesting investments. And so at one point, Felder Hardiman pulled me aside. He said, maybe you should stop bringing in companies because these are really bad companies. And you should think about what you want to invest in and like do some strategic research and thinking and create a roadmap of what you want to do. For 2 or 3 months, I stopped looking at business plans and I just went out and I found the smartest people that I could meet and said, will you please spend an hour with me because I want to hear
Mhm.
your thoughts about the future of technology and where the interesting areas are. I started off with a list of 40 possible areas of investment in tech, and I
Mhm.
started crossing them off for various reasons, such
Mhm.
as the market's not going to be big enough, or it's commoditizing, or maybe it's
Mhm.
something that I don't know enough about, or whatever it is. And I started going off meeting with these people, narrowed it down after talking to these people to 5 areas. The
Mhm.
people that I met with were folks like Al Lill at Gartner, Rick Sherland, who was a big tech equity analyst at Goldman, Eric Schmidt, who at the time was the
Mhm.
CTO of Sun,
Mhm.
and I went to talk to Eric, and a couple of others that I sort of met along this journey.
Mhm.
And then I came back to the partners at Bessemer. I said, okay, I've thought about it, and the areas I want to invest in are these, startups who are particularly going to lead in the areas of asynchronous transfer mode, which was a protocol that united telecom and datacom, network management, network security, which was actually quite provocative because nobody had
Mhm.
invested in security at that point. I thought it might be a time that people start caring about this because of the ARPANET was allowing multiple
Mhm.
companies to share information on the same network for the first time. And I thought maybe
Mhm.
people would care about rules for that. And then uh, one other one was wavelength division multiplexing, which was a way of sending different colors over the same fiber. And
Mhm.
and that led me to an investment in a company called Sienna, which does that, which is the leader in that space. And then finally, this fifth thing, which I said, there's this thing called the internet, which I think might
Mhm.
be interesting. So and I did this in about January, in like December 92 or January 93. And
Mhm.
none of the folks there had heard of the internet. And so I kind of
Mhm.
explained what it was and why I thought it might be interesting. And so with those 5 technologies identified, I went out and started proactively calling up startups that I could find who were leading in these areas. And that was a very different motion than waiting for business plans to come in.
Mhm.
And I think that it was a very successful approach. A lot of the success, though, was dumb luck. I mean, I was, the tech investor at a venture capital firm from 1992 to 1999, and that was like the greatest years ever to be picking tech companies. But this proactive approach, I think helped me a lot. And then since then, it's become standard practice at Bessemer, and
Mhm.
almost all the investors at Bessemer build roadmaps today and invest off of those strategies.
Yeah, that's quite a interesting story, and like I definitely feel like this is a really great way to actually source company or actually creating your investment thesis. I was about to ask that. So like when you were like meeting these people, how did you encounter these like super smart people? Did you sort of like read them in the news, or like were they also working at Worko? Like how do you meet them? How do you define who is smart? Like what is
Yeah.
smart? Is that like with the technical skill or like great product people or great financial people? Like how do you select these people you listen to, like hear advice from, basically?
I wanted to get a range of opinions. So I wanted to get opinions of people who buy technology. So I wanted to talk
Mhm.
to, at the time, they were called vice president of IT. There were no
Mhm.
CIOs back then. So find people who had IT budgets.
Mhm.
Find, like I said, an equity analyst in technology from an investment bank. Who was the best
Mhm.
one that I could think of was Rick Sherlin. Find the best research analyst at Gartner. So Al Lill was the best back then. Find the greatest CTO, and that was Eric Schmidt. And so I wanted a tech entrepreneur. I talked to Per Sunapee, who built a company called Codex and then sold it to Motorola, and he was running it within Motorola. So I wanted to get entrepreneurs, customers, equity analysts. Back then, there was no LinkedIn. There were no websites. There was no way to reach out to these people. But today, even with LinkedIn and even with these things, you can't, if you just send an email to somebody
no
like
one's
this, they're not going to respond.
Yeah.
And so I really had to go to the partners of the firm and say, do any of you know these people? And within the partnership, these of course were experienced entrepreneurs and investors, and they had been in the industry a long time, and among them they knew how to get to these people. Most of them were friends with these people, and so they introduced me, and that's how I got to them.
Yeah, like that's a really good strategy to have some sort of like adult supervision to kind of like go like above and beyond to like reach out to them. So after you reach out to them, like how do you stay in touch with these people to maintain them in your network? Like how do you kind of like keep providing value to them, or like think about some way to kind of make it an effective network for yourself?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I would give myself a 1 on cultivating my network. By the way, Grace, I would give you a 10. Okay.
Thank you. Oh my God.
Can
I just use the same commercial?
You are the superstar
No,
of,
you're the superstar.
networking. There's no doubt that, it would have served me well to continue to stay in touch with these brilliant people I met, as well as all the other brilliant people that I've met during my years, even back in school. And I've never been very good at doing that. It's just not within my constitution and my skill set and all that. It's very difficult for me to go through the steps that you need to. So I actually did the opposite of cultivating my network. I've made a lot of friends over the years. I love staying in touch with my friends, and I think I'm probably pretty good at it because I really enjoy it. What I've never done is actually cultivate those friendships for business opportunity. And the fact that I found myself in that hot tub was like accident. I wasn't trying to do that. And there I am, like I'm, dear friends with Susan Wojcicki, and I actually, do everything I can not to collaborate with her on this, startup that she's at called Google. Like I'm, now that you talk about it, I feel I'm not a 1 out of 10. I'm like a -5 out of 10, because I actually work against. I'm actually anti-cultivating. So thank you. I need to work on this. And I look at you, Grace, and I see how you stay in touch with people in such a positive and thoughtful way. And, I'm going to learn from that.
No. Oh my God. I'm gonna blush. Like I have foundation on, but like I already like blush, and then I'll give you like $500 after this interview, just so that you said these things about me. But anyway, thank you so much.
I take credit cards, by the way. You can send me Venmo or credit cards.
Yeah, totally. So can you walk us through about like, how did you invest in a particular company? Like what's a way of you meeting the founder, or like have you encountered at a point that you want to invest in a particular company, but they're super oversubscribed? Like how do you convince them to take the investment?
There are two different kinds of venture capital. And when I got into the business, there was only one kind. And when I got into the business, it was find, companies that are going to become big companies and figure out that these are good businesses. And if you figure out that something's a good business, then invest. That sounds like, well, isn't that what all venture capital is? The answer is no, because somewhere around sort of the global crisis, actually between the dot-com burst and the global crisis of 2008, public investors became much more skeptical about companies going public. Today, companies don't go public until they're worth billions of dollars. When a company got to 20 million of revenue, or 25 million or 35 million of revenue, it was going public. Mm-hmm. Today, you have to be like well over $100 million of revenue to go public. And that's recurring revenue, which is very high quality revenue. The venture capital asset class now supports private companies from that stage of $15 million a year of revenue up through over 100. And during that phase of growth, where the company is worth somewhere between 100 million and $1 billion, there is no longer any question that this is a valuable business. You don't have to be a PhD in engineering or whatever to look at the technology and figure out that this is important. You can look at the sales numbers and you can see, okay, there's real traction here. And without understanding the technology so deeply, you can say, this is a great business. For that kind of venture capital, the hardest thing about it is not deciding whether it's a good business. It's convincing the company to work with you as their partner. A lot of what we do at Bessemer and a lot of what lots of venture firms do, and I would say Andreessen Horowitz kind of, was one of the firms that really innovated in this space, was to explicitly promote your venture firm as a great partner so that when you find these good companies, they will work with you. And so at Bessemer, we work really hard at that. And specifically in the areas where we believe we have strengths, like in cloud computing, we believe that we can bring cloud computing companies, very specific benefits that they can't get from any other firm. And that's something that wins us deals and makes us successful. In the original kind of venture capital, which is still practiced in the early stages, I have to tell you, it's not that hard to convince a company to take your money. We're talking about businesses where it's not clear that they're going to be so successful. So these companies don't have such an easy time. It's not, they're going off trying to raise money to whatever, build a rocket or a quantum computer or some weird new food synthesis source or something like that. And if you show up and you understand the technology and you say, I share your vision and I see this and I think this is going to be a very, very important company, then, you do the deal.
Got it. So basically have the money in the bank and then that's it for early stage.
For the early stage, it's really about just trying to understand the area well and make some hard bets, like you try to really just make the hard calls. And when you do that, there's usually not a lot of competition for those companies.
You mentioned that, how do you find an area that will be very successful, right? So you hunt down the top company in this area. So in terms of picking the companies within this area, how do you know who is going to be the number one, who is going to be the number two? Can you give us an example of why did you pick company A instead of company B?
This is a very common approach for me, which is I've done a roadmap. And the roadmap tells me I want to invest in a company that does something. And then I will go find all the startups that are doing that, try to learn as much as I can about all of them, and then pick a winner. And I pick the winner really usually based just upon the team. But when I say based upon the team, that's sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the quality of the team and the decisions that team has made regarding how they're going to market and what they've built. So for example, it's not always the team. I was working in bank security. I was an investor in a company called Cyota back in the early 2000s. And based upon what I learned at that company, it was a very successful company helping banks with fraud, I realized that the hackers were moving away from hacking businesses where there really wasn't much money to make. And they were going after individuals through to basically what we call now identity theft. It didn't exist back then. And I thought, some startup is going to have to help protect consumers because there's so much money to be made from spoofing these consumers. And we didn't call it identity theft. We called it credit application fraud. That's what the banks called it. Basically, somebody applying for credit on your behalf. I mean, when we talk about identity theft, that's the most common way to monetize identity theft. So we called it credit application fraud. And I thought, somebody's got to do something about this credit application fraud stuff. Nobody else was thinking about it from a venture perspective, but there were a few startups that were playing with different solutions in it. A couple of them were very Silicon Valley archetypal startups who were thinking about technical ways to use data to figure out, whether an application was fraudulent or whatever. And the teams who were working on those looked like Silicon Valley teams. In fact, one of them was somebody from Postini, where I had been an investor. But then an analyst at Bessemer said to me that he reached out and he found this little company in Arizona that was also had a solution. And they didn't seem to have any technology really to speak of at the time, but they had tons of customers and they seemed to be growing fast. So I flew out to Arizona and I met this little company called LifeLock, which was less than a year old. And they were just really focused on customer service and signing up customers and being great at customer service. And they had a technical solution, but they had basically outsourced the technology to other products that they just bought. They were buying, not building. And the people who started it, I have to tell you, I mean, they won't mind if they see this podcast, they would agree that they were not your sort of blue chip resumes. Okay. These were people who, they'd done interesting things in their lives, but they hadn't started successful companies that they had exited and they had, but they were just super scrappy and, really focused on making, working on customer service. And I just thought in this case, for this opportunity, this consumer zeal is going to be more important than the technology perspective. And so we bet on LifeLock. We led the Series A round and many rounds after that, and ended up eventually selling it to Symantec for $2.5 billion. Other example, when I sold Skybox to Google, one of my learnings from that was that the hardest thing about deploying a successful microsat constellation was actually launching it,
Mhm.
because all of the rockets that existed back then were designed to launch multi-ton satellites to geosynchronous orbit. They were huge, enormous spacecraft that you would buy for hundreds of millions of dollars years in advance. And if you were trying to put up, small satellites one at a time in specific places, you couldn't use these big rockets. You could try to do rideshare, but you
Mhm.
had to then go to whatever altitude someone was going to at whatever inclination, and you had to wait years for it to happen. And it just didn't work. When we created a space roadmap that year, one of the opportunities on it was we have to find a startup that's going to solve the problem of launch for microsat constellations. So I looked at different companies trying to do it, including Firefly and some others. But there was this one company in New Zealand called Rocket Lab.
Mhm.
And what I really loved about Rocket Lab there was the team, and specifically the founder, Peter Beck, who was just, a super brilliant, passionate entrepreneur. He grew up in this little fishing village in New Zealand, and he and his brother would, like build rockets in their dad's garage or
Mhm.
something. And he never had any other job in his life other than just building rockets. He started this right out of school. He created this little company to, get DARPA contracts where they built, sounding rockets and
Mhm.
whatever they could. He just wanted to, like, that was what he loved. And they were really good at it. And
Mhm.
so when Elon Musk pivoted away from small payloads by taking the NASA contract, Elon canceled the Falcon 1 project and started building Falcon 9s. Peter Beck said, I'm going to go build a company to service small payloads and microsat constellations. So that's why we invested in Peter and Rocket Lab.
How did you kind of like educate yourself in this area of things that is not really visible for like the regular people on a day-to-day basis? How do you learn about for example, the rockets and like sort of like these kind of
Yeah.
very scientific things that are very forward thinking, I guess?
Yeah, so there's two ways. One is that I work at a venture firm that has really come to value the importance of learning new areas for the
Mhm.
investors. And we say that because Bessemer has been around longer than any venture firm. And I think the reason is that we're very good at reinventing ourselves and creating new strategies. And you can't do that by hiring experts every time you want to change your strategy. If you
Mhm.
hire expert investors, those expert investors are just going to keep investing in what they're expert in. You
Mhm.
need to find people who are critical thinkers, who are and intellectually courageous enough to stop doing what they're doing before that was working and start to learn how to do something different.
Mhm.
And so, in order for us to continually refresh our strategies, one thing is we have to hire people who have the skills and intellectual courage to do that. But the other thing is we have to give them time to do it. We have to say, if you want to go off and learn a new area, go do it. Take 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, whatever it takes. If
Mhm.
you don't make investments during that time, that's okay. But come back with, 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 uh, with,
With a list
you
of
know,
40.
well, come back with some, with some informed
Mhm.
strategy, as opposed
Mhm.
to something that you read on TechCrunch that day. So that's part of it. And then the second thing is that we hire operating partners and executives in residence who are
Mhm.
experts in these things. And
Mhm.
so when I said I want to build a space roadmap, I wasn't an aerospace engineer. I hadn't
Mhm.
worked at a space company. I made this one investment in Skybox and I learned something from that. But I really wanted to make sure that we were going to be well informed in our strategy. And so at Bessemer, we brought in as an operating partner Scott Smith, who recently passed away. But Scott Smith was with us for many years,
Mhm.
and he was the one of the co-founders of GOI. He was the COO of Digital Globe, and then he was also the president of Iridium for many
Mhm.
years while he was an operating partner with us. And so it was great to have him on the team. We also recruited an executive in residence named Ray Johnson, who had just prior been the chief technology officer at Lockheed Martin, in charge of all development and operations of aerospace projects.
Mhm.
And so, we had the two greatest people on
Mhm.
the planet to help us to make sure that we weren't going off the rails in our strategy.
As you mentioned, like these people are already like probably already running a very similar company in the past, but I feel like each company is really different. A lot of the skills, it's like really easy to, like, here is my strategy for you, implement it. But like, can this company actually benefiting from having a lot of strategy coming at them, or is it better for them to just hire somebody for themselves to like full on dedicate into this particular problem that this company is solving?
Yeah, I actually agree with you. And we do not impose strategy onto the companies we invest in. When I talk about bringing in the operating partners and the EIRs, that's to inform us and help us with our own strategy inside of Bessemer as we think about what companies to go fund. Once we make an investment, Scott Smith, Ray Johnson, others, they have gone on to the boards of these companies, but they've gone on not as the investor representative, I'm going to tell you what to do, but as an independent director who is recruited by those companies. We never impose them. Those companies would recruit them and actually, have them there as advisors, but as advisors, because you're right, every company has to make its own decisions. So, Ray Johnson, for example, he's on the board of Forever Oceans, which is a robotic fish farm company I funded.
That you
He's
mentioned.
he's also on the board of Rigetti Computing, which I also invested in. And he was actually on that board before I invested. So again, not imposed by us, but recruited as an independent director.
When you were observing the company that you've invested in, were the best company that like they were functioning the best on their own without a lot of board advice, or were the company that like actually listened to a lot of board advice functioning better than the other?
I can definitely think of examples of either model. There are definitely companies that have been super successful where the CEOs, I would say, have minimalist kind of board interaction. And there are others where CEOs, do a great job of engaging their boards and getting a lot of value out of them. The one thing that I think I can say, not even universally, but very largely, is that successful teams are very honest with their boards and don't spin the data and, present what's real. So even those CEOs who don't, use their boards very much, the good ones are very transparent nonetheless, even if they're not solicitous of advice.
As a founder, if I have a company that like I'm on a board meeting, I probably would just say whatever I think it's like polished, just so that like my investor don't freak out that like they kind of like tell other investor like this is they're never going to tell other investor this is a bad company to invest in, but like they would probably lose faith on us just because they probably invest in like 10 other company at the same time. Like, how do you kind of let them tell the truth?
I would say you're completely wrong. But you're not completely wrong that people do that. But I would say it's completely wrong to think that that's a good thing to do.
I don't think that's a good thing.
Qualify that.
Yeah,
I should qualify that because I've definitely seen situations where inexperienced investors, and there are lots of inexperienced investors out there, freak out when the team reports variances from plan. And those inexperienced investors start pointing fingers and sometimes they'll make really bad decisions, like saying we should fire people because they're off plan. Experienced investors know that every company will go through outcomes that vary according to the original plan. There are always variances to plans. There's no reason to freak out because something is not following plan. The only reason to freak out is if the team either is hiding it or is refusing to engage in any conversation about what to do about it. Look, I mean, I can't emphasize enough to you or to anyone who's listening to this podcast, when you're in that boardroom, in fact, even before you get to the boardroom, when there's something that's worrying you or anything, even if it's not worrying you, there's something going off plan, tell your investors, tell your board, and have a conversation that says, here's what's happening. Here's why we think it's happening or why we suspect it's happening. This is what we're doing to understand it. And this is what we think we can do in order to get things back on track. There's nothing more assuring to investors than to hear that kind of engagement back and forth. And in some ways, our job as investors when we come into these board meetings is not to find fault. It's not to, figure out what's going wrong. It's part of our job is to ask questions on a regular basis that prompts the team to check in on how things are going. Right? We had a plan. How are we doing in that plan across hiring, across revenue, across spending, across whatever it is, partners, and come back and report in the board meeting and tell us how you're doing. And if we weren't there asking, then you might not get to it because there's 100 other things demanding your attention every day. But there's a board meeting coming up in 2 weeks. So why don't you start thinking about how you're going to check in with your team and figure out what you're going to tell your investors, because now's a good time to check in and look at the forest for the trees. So our job is to ask those questions. Team's job is to come in, give an honest, feedback on it. Let us know what's going well, what's not going well. Maybe we've got some ideas on, how to help. It's always fun to, it's easy to poke fun at VCs and talk about all the stupid things that we suggest in board meetings. And, most of the things we suggest are probably stupid, but that's okay. You listen to them, throw out 9 of them. Maybe that 10th one is really going to be helpful, right? It doesn't cost you anything, right? You've already got us in the room. When we say something dumb, you could say, oh, well, I'll take that under consideration. And we know what that means. And then, but then every once in a while, it turns out we could be helpful.
I have a question on studying a particular sector. I know that you study I know that you already mentioned that you would probably map out a couple of sectors that you really like and then go deep into it, maybe take 6 months to actually study it. When you are doing that, what would be some actionable things that you do? What is the first 3 action that you take? How do you plan out the 6 months to study something to become the expert in this area?
There's all kinds of things that you can read, whether it's books or articles, or just start seeing what's out there in TechCrunch and PitchBook and, things in the investment community. But the best thing to do is to really dig down, not to look at the investment layer, but to look fundamentally. So if you want to learn about additive manufacturing, then go to the additive manufacturing users group. Talk to the people, not the investors or the reporters or whatever. Go talk to the people who actually, are buying 3D metal printers and using them, and figure out what they want. Here you can use resources like Gerson Lehrman Group and others, where they have expert panels of people and they can find people who are, doing that. Oh, you know what? I'll give you a good example. About 2 years ago, I started thinking we really should figure out quantum computing and what our roadmap is going to be around that. And I started building a roadmap around quantum computing. And I went out there and started talking to professors. You meet all the startups, talk to all the entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs are the best source of information because they'll just cut through and tell you what's going on. But I also went and talked to professors, and the professors I talked to, they all had, what was interesting is each one had a different answer, and they were pretty certain about it. One would say it's superconductors, another would say it's trapped ions, another one would say it's photons. Some professor said, quantum computing doesn't work, it's a hoax. And then I stepped back and I said, maybe talking to professors is not that helpful. Instead, let's talk to the customers. Let's talk to the scientists inside of the companies who actually will be buying quantum computers. My team and I started going off and finding the PhDs inside of the pharmaceutical companies and the materials companies and the chemical companies who actually were running the research projects using supercomputers today. They had budgets of tens of millions of dollars a year they were spending on supercomputers. And these were precisely the people who were interested in using quantum computing to solve problems that they can't solve today on supercomputers. And so we created a panel called the Quantum Computing Fellows Panel. And we have 18 of these PhDs today, and we get together twice a year to talk about what we're seeing in terms of new technology trends, what kinds of problems we're trying to solve. The PhDs are talking to each other about what problems they're using, what kinds of algorithms they're creating in quantum computing. We created this unique community in the world, and we talked to them about what they were seeing and what they wanted to do. And it was based upon their feedback that we determined that Rigetti computing was the winner in the space. For anyone who wants to learn, the best starting point is a book called Q is for Quantum. I think it's by Terry Randolph or something. That one is the easiest one to start with, and I recommend that. And then from there are
the book is
other
only
resources.
500 pages, I assume.
No. Q is for Quantum. In fact, you don't even need any math to read that one. So the person who had the biggest impact on my career would be Felda Hardiman. He's a math professor, venture capitalist, business school professor. He's been a partner at Bessemer for decades, and he's the person who mentored me as a venture investor, and as I mentioned, among other things, sent me out on my first roadmap expedition. And I learned how to manage deals and be a good board member by following him around. This is not just a wish. At some point, I will I will get Tim Minchin over for dinner.
Who
So
is
Tim
this?
Minchin, he is the most brilliant singer-songwriter out there in the world today. And the older demographic may remember Tom Lehrer, who was a great humorist musician. But this guy's like Tom Lehrer squared. He writes brilliant musicals like Matilda and Groundhog Day, but he also writes a lot of brilliant songs. And if you go to YouTube, search for his songs, for example, Storm is a great one, and my favorite, White Wine in the Sun.
Yes.
So, but he really brings together my passions both for musicals, but also for skepticism. And one thing that's common to Tim's music and his art is love of blasphemy and a call to question things and to, as he would say, ideas are not worthy simply because they've been tenacious. And that really gets to the heart of what I'm talking about when I say you need to be intellectually courageous as a venture capitalist. You also need to do so as a person.
That sounds like a really, really
Tim's
deep
my hero.
musical person.
Yeah, go check it out. Listen to his music. It's great.
Yeah.
And then in terms of books, boy, there are so many great ones. I probably The Devil's Chaplain is the book that changed my life the most by Richard Dawkins, but that's has nothing to do with venture capital. I don't really take to the business genre of books. I think that a lot of the opportunities that exist in the world today are opportunities that have to do with concepts like neural networks and other emerging properties of chaotic networks. And so reading books by Douglas Hofstadter would probably be, I just think intellectually, for me, Douglas Hofstadter books have been the most intellectually powerful books for me. Yeah, The Mind's Eye, Gödel Escher Bach, those two in particular.
Tell us about your TV show and the a cappella group.
Well, the a cappella group's an a cappella group. I'd rather talk about the TV show because it's much more relevant to venture capital. It's called Bubble Proof. If you go to bubbleproof.tv, you'll see a few different films and TV series there. The ones that I've been most involved in is a series called Bubble Proof and another one that we just released this week called Bubble Report. And what we do in these is my friend Michael Furtick and I really poke fun at venture capitalists who often take ourselves too seriously and who think of ourselves as masters of the universe when in fact we're all riding the coattails of brilliant entrepreneurs. These series are mockumentaries about egos and insecurities and vanities of venture capitalists. And we have lots of great cameos by people in the industry like Dave Hornick and Jason Pressman and Byron Dieter and Ann Miraco from Floodgate and Mike Maples and lots of other folks who show up and play themselves and have a good time.
That's super cool. What make you decided to do it? Like, I think it takes a lot of guts and like, it's like such a crazy thing. It's like a very different sort of like the VC personality of your actual day-to-day. Someone who studied the neuroscience and like thinking about the rockets. And, like, I wouldn't think of you like doing a comedy show, but here you did. This. Yeah.
Well, I think it's always funny to expose the cognitive flaws that we fall into as people. For venture capitalists, there's one that's actually for all Silicon Valley, and that's really what this show is about. There's this fear of missing out that grips people. Mm-hmm. And because we all have whatever it is, the sibling or the friend or the roommate or the classmate or somebody who struck it rich by being at Uber at the right time or something like that. All of us in Silicon Valley also have, we've all had opportunities to go join some company that later went on to become a great unicorn, either as an employee or an investor or what have you. Mm-hmm. And so, and we think, oh, I should have done it. I should have done that thing. And so next time I won't be so cautious. I won't be so skeptical. And so the fear of missing out causes us to be less skeptical. It causes us to suspend our common sense. And it causes us to embrace ideas without evidence, which is exactly why companies like Theranos were so successful perpetrating the fraud that it did, is because everybody wanted to believe. Everyone just said, even though this breaks whatever rules I've known about biotech companies, this feels like, a visionary with something that other people think is awesome. And that kind of analysis is a pathology in Silicon Valley, and it's funny to laugh at. And hopefully, in the process of laughing at others doing it, we also maybe can stop ourselves from doing it as well.
There's like a more of a TV show that's like making fun of the Silicon Valley, but like, yeah, that's like super interesting. And like, I would suggest everyone in this podcast to go watch it. I watched a tiny bit of it. Yeah, it's really fun, and it's so well produced, and like I love some of the jokes.
Great. Well, I hope you all enjoy it, and please tell your friends, because we don't have a marketing budget, so it's all word of mouth.
It's really good production quality. It's like really good production quality, and a lot of jokes are really funny, and you're in it.
Well, thank you for the plug. I hope you do I hope you continue watching it.
Yeah, like I would totally continue to watch it.
Grace, well, this has been really fun.
Thank you so much.
I hope you and your listeners all stay safe and healthy and comfortable, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. You too.